Both femurs were empty of marrow by sunrise, and the grizzly that owned the kill never touched them. Between 9:40 p.m. and 6:15 a.m. on the night of November 3, 2025, a single animal returned to a bear-killed elk in Glacier National Park's Belly River drainage 11 separate times. Never the bear, never a second predator, the same animal on the same 41-minute interval, start to finish. The carcass itself was routine for this kind of station. A grizzly had killed the elk 2 days earlier, fed, then buried what was left under duff and branches the way bears do when a kill is too large to finish in one sitting. Standard behavior logged at hundreds of similar sites across this range every fall. A carnivore monitoring camera, mounted on a lodgepole pine roughly 30 feet from the kill, was there for exactly this reason. Caching sites like this one are where wolverine researchers get most of their usable footage. What made this particular file worth pulling out of the season's routine data is the return pattern itself, a regularity that didn't match anything in the station's 4 previous winters of data. The same animal, identifiable frame to frame by a pale, asymmetric blaze across its chest, kept coming back on a clock. Picture the drainage at that hour. Hard frost already on the exposed rock, the carcass site sitting in a narrow band of spruce between open avalanche chute and creek bottom, the kind of terrain a scavenger uses because it offers both cover and a fast retreat in either direction. This was not the grizzly returning to feed on its own kill. The bear's own collar data, cross-referenced afterward, placed it bedded more than 400 meters upslope for the entire window. It was not a second wolverine trading off with the first. Every visible frame showed the same chest pattern, and no second individual crossed the detection zone at any point. And it was not a wolf or a coyote working the same routine. Neither species caches food the way this animal was caching it in short, repeated, almost metronomic trips. The interval itself is the detail nobody on the review team has been able to explain away. A wolverine caching food typically carries a portion some distance from a carcass, buries or wedges it into cover, and returns, a round trip long enough that consecutive visits should drift, not repeat, within minutes of the same interval 11 times running. Caching that far away doesn't leave time to come back this often. Where that carcass sat matters as much as what came back to it all night. Wolverines were trapped, hunted, and poisoned out of most of the lower 48 states through the late 1800s and early 1900s, and the population never recovered to anything close to its former range. What survives today exists almost entirely in small, disconnected pockets of Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Washington, and northeastern Oregon. A fraction of a range that once reached south through the Rockies into New Mexico and down the Sierra Nevada into Southern California. In November 2023, after more than 2 decades of petitions, lawsuits, and reversed federal decisions dating back to 1995, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the wolverine as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. The current estimate for the entire lower 48 is roughly 300 animals, the majority of them in Montana. A more recent assessment puts the effective breeding population, the number of animals actually capable of contributing to the next generation, at fewer than 40. It would be easy to file 11 visits from one small carnivore as an overcounted, overexcited read on ordinary scavenging behavior. That explanation survives a single distant sighting from a hunter at dusk. It does not survive individually identifiable frames on a synchronized camera clock at a station run by a program with 4 prior winters of baseline data on exactly how this species normally behaves at exactly this kind of site. It would also be easy to assume the footage itself is unreliable. A malfunctioning timestamp, a camera double-triggering on wind, or a branch moving in front of the lens. The station's clock was cross-checked against 2 neighboring units on the same grid, both logging unrelated wildlife on schedule throughout the same night with no drift, and the unit itself was retrieved, inspected, and returned to service with no fault found in its trigger mechanism. And it would be easy to assume this is simply a well-fed animal gorging opportunistically, the way any scavenger might on an unguarded kill. Wolverines are documented as exceptionally efficient scavengers, capable of digging through 6 feet of snow to recover a carcass they cached weeks earlier. But efficient is not the same word as this particular rhythm. Repeated 11 times in 9 hours with a consistency ordinary opportunism doesn't produce, and it would be easy to assume a species this rare simply couldn't have an individual nearby capable of this kind of travel, that the population is too thin, too scattered, for one animal to be running a route this practiced. Camera-identified individuals on this same grid have previously been confirmed holding home ranges exceeding 600 square kilometers, more than enough ground for a resident animal to know a single drainage in exactly this kind of detail. Montana's wolverine habitat is not small. The state has banned trapping of the species since 2012, and its known range across the northern Rockies spans well over 10,000 square kilometers of connected high country, roughly the combined footprint of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. Most of it steep, roadless, and snowbound more than half the year, which is exactly why a program like this one needs dozens of camera stations and years of baseline data just to establish what ordinary behavior looks like before anything unusual can be flagged at all. Understanding exactly who runs this station and why a bear-killed elk was being watched at all matters before anything else about this file makes sense. The camera is one node in a long-running carnivore monitoring grid operated by biologists working across Glacier National Park's major drainages, Kintla, Marias Pass, Belly River, and others, in partnership with regional carnivore research groups that have logged multiple winters of wolverine and lynx detection work across this same stretch of the northern Rockies. None of the researchers running this grid came to it chasing a single sighting. The program exists precisely because wolverines are difficult enough to detect that a single confirmed individual can represent months of fieldwork, hundreds of kilometers of track surveys, and dozens of unproductive camera pulls for every usable frame. Winters here are spent mostly on stations that catch nothing at all, which is part of why a night like this one gets checked so carefully before anyone treats it as more than routine data. The station itself was provisioned the way any carcass monitoring site is provisioned once a fresh kill is reported. Camera mounted at a fixed height and angle, synchronized to the grid's master clock, left in place to document scavenger succession at the carcass over the following weeks without any bait or lure added. The elk itself was already more attractant than any station on the grid normally has access to, and the crew's only intervention was choosing where to mount the unit for the clearest possible view of the kill site. The first 2 nights after the kill were unremarkable, the grizzly feeding, then bedding nearby, then a raven and a pair of magpies working the exposed portions during daylight while the bear dozed within sight of its own cache. That was the site's expected pattern, consistent with dozens of other cached kill stations the program has documented in past seasons, and nothing about those first 48 hours suggested the file would end up anywhere but the season's routine archive. The pattern broke on the 3rd night. A researcher reviewing the week's footage during a routine data pull noticed the timestamp gaps first, visit after visit, landing close to the same 41-minute mark. Before noticing that every frame showed the identical chest blaze, a marking distinctive enough that the program's own photo catalog could confirm it against a previously documented individual from the same general drainage. What the review file eventually cataloged from that single night amounts to its own inventory, built the way any flagged anomaly on this grid gets built before it earns a second look. The visit log itself, 11 confirmed appearances between 9:40 p.m. and 6:15 a.m., intervals ranging from 38 to 44 minutes apart, tight enough that no single gap stands out as an outlier. The individual identification, a chest blaze pattern, matched across all 11 visits, cross-checked against the program's photo catalog of known individuals in the drainage, and confirmed as a single animal, not a coincidental resemblance between two similar-looking wolverines. The bear's GPS collar log, obtained from a separate research partner tracking grizzlies in the same drainage, continuous location data placing it bedded upslope, outside any plausible return window, for the entire night. The carcass itself examined the following morning, both femurs cracked and cleared of marrow, far more processing than the same research team has documented from a single wolverine visit in any prior case file on record. And the snow and duff around the kill site, a single consistent set of tracks, the same print dimensions on every pass, with no second trackway crossing it at any point in either direction. And nights like this one. A single animal on a single camera producing a pattern nobody on the review team can fully explain. Turn up in long-running survey archives like this more often than most people watching this would expect. Subscribing with notifications on is the only way to know when the next one gets reviewed and released. Now, back to that carcass in the Belly River drainage. No search followed because nothing here had gone missing. What followed was a check of the two nearest stations on the same grid, both within 4 kilometers, for any sign of a cache site receiving that kind of unusual traffic. Neither station logged anything out of pattern that same week, and a follow-up snow survey around both stations found no fresh cache sign large enough to account for 11 separate loads of meat. Whatever this animal was doing with the meat, it carried away 11 times. It wasn't caching it anywhere. The grid was already watching. The federal government's own position on this species is not a comment on this specific case, but it frames everything around it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's 2023 listing decision was built on a formal species status assessment concluding that a warming climate, shrinking spring snowpack, and habitat fragmentation together put the wolverine's long-term survival in the lower 48 at real risk, a finding based on population trends and denning habitat, not on individual feeding behavior. That listing followed a court-ordered deadline after nearly a decade of the agency reversing itself, first proposing protection in 2013, withdrawing it, denying it again in 2020, and only reaching a final threatened designation after a federal court in Montana ordered a new decision by the end of November 2023. More than a year after that listing took effect, the agency still had not designated the legally required critical habitat as of early 2026, a delay serious enough that conservation groups have taken the agency to federal court over it a second time. That regulatory context explains why so few resources exist to formally investigate an anomaly like this one. It does not explain the interval itself. A species this closely tracked, with this much invested in understanding its baseline behavior, still produced a night of footage nobody on the research side can fully reconcile with the published record. One point about this file requires complete transparency, stated exactly where it belongs, and not folded into a footnote. Researchers who work wolverine carcass sites across the northern Rockies have described, informally and outside any published study, wolverines returning to actively guarded carrion, kills a bear or wolf pack is still defending, far more often than the formal literature reflects. That pattern has never been systematically documented or officially confirmed by any agency. It exists as field experience passed between people who work this specific kind of site, and it deserves to be weighed exactly that way, not as an established behavioral finding. The reason a pattern like that would circulate quietly rather than get published outright is not complicated. A species with an effective breeding population under 40 individuals draws intense scrutiny over every claim made about it, and a research community that has spent 30 years fighting for this species' legal protection has strong reasons to be conservative about publishing behavior claims that outrun the data actually collected, even when individual field biologists privately suspect the data is already there. Attached to almost any other North American carnivore, 11 visits in one night wouldn't draw a second look. But this species already carried a documented history into the review. In the early 1900s, unregulated trapping and predator control campaigns erased wolverines from most of their historic range, from the Sierra Nevada to the southern Rockies. In 2012, Montana banned wolverine trapping outright, acknowledging how little margin the remaining population had left. In 2023, after 3 decades of legal fights dating back to a first petition in 1995, the species finally received federal protection because the same population had never recovered enough to survive without it. A species that keeps surfacing at the exact edge of extinction, on a documented rhythm spanning more than a century, stops reading as a series of separate near misses. It starts reading like an animal that has been operating past the point where its own survival math should have run out, which may be exactly why one of them, on one night, did something the published feeding rate data says a single wolverine shouldn't be able to do. That pattern is not confined to history. The unresolved habitat lawsuit, still active as this file is being reviewed, is itself evidence that the state of knowledge about this species, where it lives, how it survives, what it's actually capable of, remains incomplete in ways federal researchers are still fighting to close. Extreme scavenging efficiency in this genus is not unique to Montana. Wolverine researchers working reindeer country in Scandinavia have spent decades documenting animals capable of caching far more meat, far faster than early population models assumed, findings that repeatedly forced wildlife agencies there to revise how much a single wolverine could remove from a carcass in a single night, and how far it could reasonably be expected to travel while doing it. The architecture is the same on both continents, a small, underestimated predator, and a research community that kept having to raise its own numbers to match what its own cameras were showing it. Nothing that follows is established as fact. It is the only account this single night of footage and the data around it actually support, and no more than that. One reading of the file places it like this: an animal already familiar with this exact stretch of the Belly River drainage, aware of a cache site close enough to complete a round trip in well under the time researchers assumed such trips required, working a fixed, efficient loop through full darkness, while the carcass's original owner slept undisturbed 400 meters upslope. 11 trips, one animal, one interval, repeated with a consistency that has nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a route it had clearly run before that night, on ground it had clearly used this way before. The physical record doesn't move once the theories are set aside. 11 visits in 9 hours, one identifiable animal, an interval that barely varies, marrow cleared from bone faster than any prior case file on this program's own record, and a cache site that isn't within 4 kilometers of anywhere the grid is already watching. None of it has been reconciled with the published feeding rate literature this research program otherwise relies on for its own baseline numbers. This channel does not claim to know where that meat went, and it will not pretend the researchers who reviewed this file know either. A chest pattern match and a stopwatch are not the same thing as a mapped cache site. What the record shows is what the record shows, and where the record stops, this account stops with it. Files like this one, routine monitoring data that turns out to break the program's own baseline, surface out of long-running carnivore surveys more often than most people expect, and most of them start exactly the way this one did, as somebody's scheduled data pull, flagged because a timestamp gap looked too regular to ignore. If you know of a case that belongs in this archive, the comments are usually where it starts. The camera is still mounted on that lodgepole pine above the Belly River, running on the same schedule it always has. The grizzly has since abandoned the site. The wolverine has not been seen there since.